Kei ngā hau tipuna, ko hui hui mai nei, tēnā koutou. Nei a mihi riri atu nā, ki ngā maunga, ki ngā awa, ko rauika mai nei, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'd like to welcome you all to our very first discussion on climate change action. This is going to be part of a series that we deliver. The landscape architects, as you all know, are well positioned to really be leaders in climate change adaptation and mitigation. At the recent IFLA conference, landscape architecture was described as a critical discipline to better the world. As such, we as a board have been working, with the support of the advocacy group, have been working on developing a knowledge growth strategy. And the purpose of that is to accelerate knowledge growth in climate change adaptation and mitigation, te ao Māori, and the interface between these two things, to uplift landscape architecture to better be recognised as climate change adaptation professionals, and to arm landscape architects with the tools they need to better serve, protect and regenerate the ecosystems and communities of Aotearoa. As part of the NZILA's work to support knowledge growth for members, these climate change action discussions are supported by Firth will take place on an ongoing basis, both in person and online, and that will be delivered over the course of 1 to 2 years. I'd also like to acknowledge Bernice from Firth. Firth have been incredible supporters of the industry. To begin the conversation, our climate change conversation, we're very lucky and very delighted to invite Professor Bronwyn Hayward as our very first person to talk about really and give us an overview of where Aotearoa sits politically within the climate action space. Bronwyn is a professor in the Department of Political Science at UC. And she is also the director of the Sustainable Citizenship and Civic Imagination Research Group. Her bio is actually quite extensive, and quite frankly, I'd probably need a book to get through it all. But I just would also like to acknowledge that her areas of research are within democracy, sustainability, and young people. She was a lead author on the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change for their special report. Bronwyn was a co-leader in the section on cities and infrastructure, and so we're very honoured to have someone so incredible come and talk to us.
If it's all right with you, I thought I'd spend 10 minutes and just 10 to 15 minutes and just talk about some of the key messages that came out of the last, what we call the AR6, the Assessment Round 6 cycle of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So it produced 6 reports in the last 8 years. The one that I first served on was the 1.5 report, which was a special report talking about what difference it makes if we're able to hold the world's temperatures around 1.5. That was a very fraught report to serve on. There was a lot of criticism about why we would even bother, because we knew we were going to crash through it. What it really taught me was that actually bringing the conversation into the present, because we are now very close to 1.5, if not through it really for reasons I'll talk about in a minute, means that we're talking about issues that we can see right now. And I was thinking about how much that conversation has changed, because in 2018, when that report came out, I had to do a little piece for Radio New Zealand, and they said, what are the key messages? And I said, well, one of the key messages is that we can see climate change now. What we are observing is the effect of human-induced climate change. And the reporter rang back and said, do you want to correct that first sentence? You made a mistake that we can see climate change now. And I said, no, that's the report. And I realised that suddenly we've brought it into the present tense, because we were always talking about the bigger things that would happen later. And suddenly it's something that we are understanding has already affected, and for many of us it's already affected our own memories of climate. If you think, as Sam Dean from NIWA points out, if you think about your own historical experiences of climate, growing up here in Otatahi, Christchurch, I remember Mum hanging out the nappies, and that was when we had cloth nappies, and my little sister's nappies would like freeze in the morning under heavy frost, and it was really exciting to go out there and punch them and break them into tiny little fragments. Now, we don't have frosts like that anymore, and it's a kind of an unusual but shared memory of a cohort of what it used to be like. But certainly when the adaptation report came out in 2022, there was a lot of debate behind the scenes. The evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat. Since 2015, what's changed? Well, the world has agreed that climate change is real, that we can see it. Trump's administration pulled out not because they disagreed with that, but because they didn't want to pay for it. And there was a debate about how much the US should pay for this. The big debate was the further delay in global action will, now this was the whole debate about the metaphor, will miss the rapid closing window that we have to act. And the problem is that you don't want to appear like the child that cries wolf, because we have about a decade. What I hadn't understood as a political scientist till I served on the panel was the fact that to establish a global mean, you use multiple years of average temperatures. So it's not the first time you crash through 1.5 or the first time you crash through 1.2 or 1.3. It's about the decade in which you've done that you would say that, okay, we can now agree that the world has warmed. And I think also, as a political scientist, it took me a long time to really understand, well, you think, well, 1.5, it's not much, it's not much since the 1880s. And as my physics colleagues quickly taught me, that is the mass that we're heating the atmosphere and our oceans. It is an enormous shift in global temperatures. And if we were thinking about and had worked more with communication experts at the beginning, we would have talked more about climate change or whether we talk about emergency or crisis, I'll come back to later, but we would have used language that was easier for people to understand, because initially people were saying, well, this temperature is warming, but we're not seeing it. We're seeing massive rainstorms or snowfall or heavier snowfall or whatever. So trying to explain that severe shift took a while. And then I remember a communication expert telling the panel, why did we choose greenhouse gases? 3/4 of the world has never seen a greenhouse. It means nothing to people. Why didn't you just say heat trapping gases? And it's those kind of things that are so practical, but at the edge of making people understand the world around them in different ways. And it's a real joy to talk to landscape architects who are working at the interface of what communities are experiencing and what they might imagine could be, and how we might achieve that shared imaginary. So the basics are, yes, we have observed at least a 1.1 to 1.2 degree warming since the 1880s when we started using a lot of fossil fuels. Yes, global warming has caused widespread disruptive change in climate. And things like the Black Summer for Australia, which had effects over here as well, those are sort of dramatic, and they are, as we know, identity-altering experiences for communities as well. The complicating factors are the compounding and cascading nature of the risks. Already about 3.3 to 3.6 billion people are living in what we would call climate hotspots, which are places where they are highly exposed to severe climate change. But those hotspots, while most of them are in sub-Saharan Africa, in the small island states, and in parts of Asia, particularly where we've got humidity issues, also within cities, we can have communities that are more excessively exposed to heat than others, or more excessively exposed to different climate effects. And it's cities that I worked on co-leading the report for and learnt a lot about concrete. And actually it's a joy to talk at an event. You never think you get to do these kind of things, where actually concrete and transport are two of the key things. When you think about cities being the site of over 70% of the world's emissions, cities are at the scale at which people can actually tackle that. So the fact that cities and sometimes states in the US context are so important is why the US was able to continue its downward decline in emissions even when Trump had pulled out from the Paris Climate Agreement. And I would just also emphasise that there's 24 countries in the world, and New Zealand is not one of them, which has managed to have a decline in our emissions for over a decade. And I think we forget to say that. And they're big economies like the US and like the UK. Yes, of course, there's a lot of European countries in there, and there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. So yes, of course, there were lots of countries that are able to quickly switch. It's from high emission to other kinds of energy, and our profile is challenged in that way with a lot of hydro and a lot of methane. But we are at risk of talking ourselves out of the ability to imagine how actually easy it is to do this. And it does really matter that we think about the city scale of emissions because, from my point of view, working also on issues for youth, by the middle of this century, by 2050, 66% of the world will be living in cities. New Zealand is already one of the most highly urbanised in the world. But 7 out of 10 young people under the age of 24 will be in cities. So cities are where major population, innovation and change is happening, and major exposure to risk. One of the things that was different about this set of reports that we produced was an emphasis on health. So climate-related illnesses, including the threats on mental health and well-being, are observed now as increasing and interconnected, but unevenly distributed. And we know now much more about the effect of green space on mental health and well-being and its climate abilities. So there are lots of things that you're sitting at the interface of in terms of the co-benefits for communities that make an enormous difference. And we also know that most countries in the world have now produced climate adaptation plans, but they haven't actually implemented them yet. And we're not adapting fast enough. The other thing that we really know is that there are increasingly large, what we're calling adaptation gaps, between the action that is being taken and the action that's needed and where it's needed. And the gaps are the largest for the poorest communities. So one of the key messages that came out of the final synthesis report is if you have limited funding, which nearly everyone does for reasons we'll talk about in a minute, spend it on the most marginalised and the poorest communities, because that has the biggest effect. Now that's not going to be what happens, because the communities who are the most well-heeled, the most resourced, are going to be the ones that are demanding the seawalls. And for all sorts of reasons that hard protection is a problem. But all the research shows spend the money on the poorest and it has the biggest flow-on effect for the wider community. And it's not all bad. I'm taking the beautiful Riccarton bush here because there are options we can take to reduce risks for people and nature. But there are some processes that the research that's been reviewed for this last 8 years has shown overwhelmingly make a difference to effective adaptation. So AR6 stands for Assessment Round 6, has highlighted that adaptation solutions that are effective are ones that are both feasible and conform to principles of justice, both procedural justice, and I really emphasise this as we're about to go into fast-tracking legislation, which, from my listening, leaders from the left and the right are welcoming as an opportunity to get their projects through. And there is nothing in the evidence that shows that fast-tracking is the way to go. In fact, fast-tracking is a path to maladaptation because it doesn't conform to the basic evidence, which is that you need procedural justice. So you need to ensure that you do give time and opportunity for people to have voice and to debate issues. You need to make sure that you've dealt fairly with the distributive justice, who's benefiting and who's going to bear the burdens of this, and how are we going to adjust for that. And the recognition justice there, whose voices are we hearing and what and why and where. So it might contribute to the obstruction economy that the Prime Minister talks about, but inclusive, integrative and equitable decision making is the most effective. there is now 4 decades of research that shows this. One of the things that it was a privilege to be part of was the effect of Trump pulling out of the Paris Agreement was that there was a fluster about where the land report would be held, and we got a call about whether New Zealand would hold the special report on land, and so we ended up holding it here. And I would really like to pay tribute to Nai Tuhariri and Professor Tamari Tau, who, when I rang them and said, so can we bring 160 scientists out to you? Fine. And the timing of that was wonderful because while the IPCC is an inherently conservative body because it's going on the common denominator knowledge, it was what was important about these reports, and particularly in the synthesis and the final reports on adaptation from last year and the year before, was that they recognised the value of diverse forms of knowledge and specifically talked about the value of Western scientific and Indigenous and local knowledge to understand and evaluate climate adaptation and the processes and actions we need to reduce risks. And not only that, but for the first time they had Indigenous and local contributors to writing reports about issues and community experiences and knowledge. The concept that we are hoping to talk about a lot is climate resilient development, which is integrated adaptation and mitigation, and trying to get communities and countries to understand that the most effective actions are the ones where you are both reducing your emissions but also protecting your population. It's not always possible, but it often is, and it's more possible than we think. It reduces climate risks through the adaptation, it reduces greenhouse gases through the mitigation, it enhances biodiversity, and the big argument is it supports sustainable development for all. But there were some key things that were highlighted that made this very significant, and one of them was that 197 countries signed this off, and they signed off that the process of making climate resilient development possible is inclusive procedural justice. So we signed that, but all the nations signed it, so that's why it takes so long, because they all have to agree. And it has some direct effects for on-the-ground practice, which I'll come back to in a minute. But I just want to talk briefly about cities for a second. The importance of physical and green infrastructure was really stressed in this round of reports. So most countries are investing in physical and grey infrastructure, the things like the seawalls in particular, but also early warning systems like sirens. Now, there are, of course, early warning systems are crucial, but as everybody here will know, the problem with the physical infrastructure, especially the seawalls, if you think about anywhere like St Clair, for instance, they're just creating both a moral hazard, as everybody feels, oh well, we've got this seawall and we'll keep investing, and we have a huge problem that's just happened within Westport. If you think about the 14 homes that Kaianga Ora is now building within basically that temporary, what is to be a temporary walled area. It's unbelievable that that's been enabled. So the IPCC is trying to emphasise the importance of integrated green infrastructure, the nature-based plus engineering approaches, the green and blue spaces, and using them creatively. The roles of urban agriculture are moving from the fringe to central ways of thinking about how to support particularly large cities and informal cities, where we're seeing largest movement is into the informal slums and communities, but also into medium-sized cities. So thinking about how those areas are going to be serviced is important. We don't think enough about the integration of the green and the social infrastructure. We have, after COVID, suddenly started to understand the importance of social safety nets, like income replacement, like health, education investment in a crisis, the role of social cohesion, of trust, of whanaungatanga, of the basic opportunities, that by designing spaces that support those opportunities, you are creating those opportunities for that coming together of people that have all the wider benefits we know, the public health improvement, the ecosystem conservation. one of the key messages from this series of reports has been around ecosystem-based adaptation, about building resilience of biodiversity, supporting ecosystem integrity and its benefits for livelihoods, people and well-being, and protecting and restoring those ecosystems being essential for biosphere resilience. The importance of thinking carefully about land use, including trees, and where they're planted and how they're planted and what they're planted, because if we don't think about those, we are really risking exacerbating a lot of the fire hazards, the social cohesion and the problems that we know only too well after the Gisborne disaster. Biodiversity and ecosystem services have limited capacity though to adapt to warming levels. So there is also a kind of a worry that we have as authors, that there are two things that are happening. One is that governments have signed up to climate resilient development because that sounds like, resilience, we can do it. Actually, we can only do it if we are making decisions in just, fair ways. And they're all signing up to nature-based solutions, except that the Global South doesn't like the term nature-based solutions because it also sounds like something we can do, like just fix these things and we can fix our excessive, unfair and unjust emissions with nature-based solutions. But we also don't know how those nature-based solutions are going to work once we crash through 1.5 and get closer to 2 degrees of warming. So some of the key things that the government signed off, which I had to grin as a political scientist, is yes, they agreed that political commitment and follow-through and well-aligned policies are crucial. And if you don't think that, just think we have just had 3 inching years turning the curve down. And now we have an incoherent climate policy, I have to say. And we're unsure what the next alignment will be. It's perfectly feasible that we could have a strong emphasis, and we need a bigger emphasis on technological development. But that has to be aligned with thinking about reductions in infrastructure and reductions in practice. It's not a get out of jail free card to just put more solar panels everywhere. So enhancing knowledge, getting our institutional frameworks right, our clear goals and priorities, and an inclusive approach to governance were all seen as key issues. But in particular, I would stress planning to identify low regrets options that enable mitigation and adaptation in the face of complex, deep uncertainty and divergent views. Landscapers are the first to understand the times that we have fast-tracked what we thought we needed. High-rise buildings in Grenville Towers, for example, create pathways that lock in dependency and create disasters of their own. So it is crucial that we actually think professionally about how we're going to develop these climate resilient pathways. Our past choices and actions have already limited some. And many communities with low income, low resources have fewer opportunities to diversify. The key barriers that, again, 197 countries acknowledged were a lack of political commitment, a lack of private sector and citizen engagement, this is globally, insufficient mobilisation of finance, this was a huge issue, particularly for developing countries, low climate literacy, but really that's because of a low climate. It's not just that people don't know, but that we actually need to then use what we know to put it into practice. And just a general low sense of urgency. But I would be careful what we wish for. I've always resisted the term climate emergency, and I still resist it. Experiencing the Christchurch earthquakes as a Democrat, I'd always resisted the use of emergency powers. We've never seen emergency powers used effectively and sustainably in ways that produce good outcomes. Yes, it is frustrating where we have multiple jurisdictions that have multiple regulations. There are things that we could change and we need to change. But if we get into this mentality that everything is an emergency, then we're stripping our children and our future of not only a sustainable future, but a democratic one. And my real worry is that there is an unspoken consensus now, and we've seen it with ECAN, that actually these fast-track powers are going to be quite good, because they're going to enable the things that we all want to get done, whoever we all are on different sides, which introduces a kind of clientelism that we have not seen in New Zealand government for decades. We had low rates of corruption, but we now have our MPs saying openly to their local electorates, well, what do you want on the list? And the moment that you can do that as an MP and skip your parliamentary practices and the normal scrutiny of everyday business, we're in trouble. And I know that it will bring a lot of business for professional organisations like landscape, like building, like construction, like law firms. And I know that there's massive alignment to fit in with this. But as professionals, as people who care about democratic practice and people who care about avoiding maladaptation and low regrets, these are issues we really need to think about carefully, while recognising that we have had difficulty in the past and still have difficulty getting big, expensive projects off the ground. Because adaptation finance comes predominantly still from the public sector. As a leading banker said to me, Bronwyn, we just haven't figured out a way to make money out of adaptation yet. So it comes mainly from public sources, as noted in the reports and the summaries, and there is a big cost disparity, so it's already starting to cost more. The best adaptation you can do is to do it at the beginning, but mostly, especially in developed economies, we're retrofitting everything, which is expensive. But overwhelmingly, the investment that we do have, which is not enough, is spent in mitigation. So finally, in closing, I just want to emphasise this problem that is a big problem for nature-based solutions, which is that climate resilient development is already challenging, and it's going to be more challenging as we get into warmer levels of global warming. Ngāi Tahu's whakatauki mō tātou e mō ka uri a muri ake nei, for us and our children after us, has never meant so much as it does now. But I would say that is also wonderful to be able to mention we are very proud that we're hosting the United Nations World Adaptation Futures Conference here in Aotearoa, and we really are hoping that we will be able to work and feature, in particular there is a big feature around cities and climate adaptation and use and biodiversity. There's a big focus on Indigenous and Pacific leadership, and there's a big focus on infrastructure and agriculture. So we are looking forward to continuing this conversation, and we are really hoping to work with ways in which we could feature some of the key things that you're doing and the key industries to another 5,000 researchers and practitioners and companies, both not all travelling. We're going to make it, which has made it an incredibly expensive undertaking, to be also broadcast through UNTV, but also here. So kia ora, and thank you very much for having me. It's fantastic.
Our urban environments, if we think about them as a fabric, are deeply rooted in Western ideology currently. And there's issues around equity, there's issues around health, and I guess if we think about our urban environment and we think about our current urban design principles as like a pattern, and the result is the fabric, perhaps it's time that we rethink the pattern. And we talk a lot about, I suppose within landscape architecture, you know, we have got tools at our disposal, you know, and that's working with nature. But how can we dig deeper and introduce a deeper level of nature into that urban fabric? And I'm thinking particularly here in Ōtautahi, the work that we were involved in with Matapōpiri and the concept of mahinga kai as a knowledge system, and the blueprint that was developed, which was really, it was very, I suppose, based on Lynchian theory and really brought forward a lot of our current urban design principles. But and yes, we worked hard to integrate mana whenua narratives and values. But what we didn't do is really integrate deeply the concept of mahinga kai, which would give us a very different urban fabric. And I'm thinking about how we can better integrate Indigenous knowledge systems to rethink the fabric itself. It's one thing to use green infrastructure and to introduce nature-based solutions, but we're still doing it within an existing pattern. So I think it's time that we started delving deeper into understanding that pattern and reimagining what that might look like. Is less of a question and more for a rant, but I also I also recently attended a symposium. It was a Primary Industries Climate Adaptation Symposium, and it was quite interesting because there was no real thought or consideration of the relationship between urban environments and rural productive environments. So I guess where I'm going with this is that what seemed to jump out at me, and going back to the idea of the pattern, is why aren't we blending more our productive rural environments, our living environments, and also our natural environments? Do we need to have everything segregated the way that we've segregated? Is urban the right solution, given the challenges ahead? Is there a more resilient solution to the way in which we live?
It's really interesting. Sort of can see Jackie there thinking about that boundary, that peri-urban boundary. It's a very colonial construct, and one of the things that really struck me was you actually hosted an Indigenous planning conference, and it was after the earthquakes, and people said, how do you feel after the earthquakes, what's it like to work there? And I was waiting for everyone to say, oh, it's terrible. Oh. And what really struck me was that all the young Māori urban planners are going, it's fantastic. Like, it's the first time we're at the table, it's the first time we've got design. And I thought, far out, it takes like a major natural disaster to rip apart the fabric of something and actually enable new spaces and things to be created. It's interesting because there's two ways that I've been just hearing. There'll be lots of ways you're hearing this conversation, but two ways about this. One is groups like He Pūtahitanga's Kohanga Kai movement. So they had 457 marakai across the South Island, and they range from small pots outside people's houses in emergency and apartment accommodation through to big mara that are at schools and communities. But they've provided navigator support, so there's people there to help you take the risks, how to plant, what happens if it gets frosted and you lose everything. And for the first time, I was part of an evaluation panel, but people were saying, that they wouldn't have been able to invest in things like parsley because it was so much cheaper and easier to feed a whole lot of kids if you've got 3 tins of baked beans than $5.80 worth of parsley that you've planted and you're not sure if it's even going to grow properly. If somebody's helping you take that risk, then it makes a big difference. And I was thinking about that because the whole colonial experience of losing land means that you're more likely, if you're Māori, to be in that housing situation. And it had been funded under a Ministry of Health initiative that was to think out of the box. But one of the first responses from the Ministry of Health, when the communities were overwhelmingly talking about the co-benefits of what had happened from this experiment, was, but how does that fix diabetes? And I just thought, far out. Here you've reached 3,800 people who are overwhelmingly talking about huge transformation. And we're fixated on the single point. At the same time, that program EAT that's being developed by Angela, just forgot her name, for food producers, about how do we talk about food and how it's produced and its narratives and its stories. It could become quickly derailed as just a commercial process, but it is the same impetus of how do we, coming from completely different communities, but how do we tell these narratives about what it means to grow food? And it's picking up the fishing, the hunting and the agriculture and the chefs in the EAT process in a very similar pattern when I was reading that as the Marakai projects are picking up communities. And I think you know food tells stories, and you know that the growing food then reveals lots of things. So I haven't got any solution for how we crack the old colonial, this is the city and that's the country, but there is something around shared meals, shared food, shared gardens that has always worked. It's just how do you scale that up?
Yeah, I think if we can create environments that can produce their own food, that are contributing to biodiversity, contributing also to ecological systems, then that's really the solution. We're not reliant, less reliant on, I suppose, council services, less reliant on our large horticultural practices, on the primary industries. They're under enormous pressure at the moment. There's new, they're having to meet increasing demands from the government, and we know that they're struggling. But if we can reduce some of that pressure off them by producing food ourselves within our urban areas, then that sort of, that surely that lessens that pressure, and then that land can also be put to other purposes as well.
But also the concern that I've got, which I imagine is shared by the industry, is our approach to housing density is not thinking about the fact that it's not learning the lessons of Grenville or other lessons where we need cheap and affordable housing, and we need it now, and we need it to be walkable, but we also need it to be cool. We need people to have green space. We need places because the social cohesion of the bumping into people's spaces really matters. And I'm thinking about really basic things that make a huge difference, like Burnside Primary School has 52 nationalities in that little primary school, and their international garden provided a way in which families could plant things that came from their communities, could talk about their communities. They had meals that spun off of that. It was very simple, but it creates environments in which there's an excuse for people to bump into each other, to actually mix, and we have fewer and fewer of those spaces. So there's all sorts of reasons why thinking about different uses of space is so crucial for democracy as well.
Well, we have the roadmap. It's called Papakainga.
I was going to say that, but
so I think I'm going to open that out now and see if there are questions from other people that they'd like to ask Bronwyn.
When you talk about 70% of the impact is generated through cities, and then we've got 2/3 of cities will then be filled with younger people, so there's great elements for change there. It'd just be good to hear a bit more about the difference we could make numerically, and I know this.
Yeah.
So, with the sort of practices that we're talking about and that we're all on board with anyway.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking that one of the things, so there's a lot of resistance. People say, Christchurch is not Copenhagen. Why are we all doing this? But actually, if we could get into the habit, like we do with the Dow Jones Index, of actually just publishing, even if it's only quarterly, we publish beyond the City Council website tucked away, what are our overall emissions? And we could see where we've reduced them. We could see the fact that we've supposedly capped out on fuel, although watch this space, and new fuel use. We could see our air emissions and our air quality, as well as our overall carbon emissions, going down. I mean, I don't want to make a fetish out of carbon, but it is a number that now that we've got it, at least thank goodness the students and the school strike made this a moral conversation and not just a technical one. But when we have the technical data, let's talk about how our cities are overall contributing. It would be great to be able to look at the overall contribution of Auckland compared to some of the other similar sized cities, but just so that people feel a bit more like actually when you can see that curve bending, it gives you that sense of impetus. And I think that's one of the things I've really noticed that's different in the New Zealand conversation from other places, is that we are overwhelmingly negative about the ability of us. We have really taken on board the argument that we are a small country, we can't do anything that other countries. Everyone says they're a small country. I've even sat in on meetings in America where they've described themselves as a small emitter. But actually the sense that we can make change, and I think at the scale of a city, being able to celebrate the difference that we're making overall somehow we have to break this culture war, which is going to be really hard because it's an extremely powerful political tool, but this culture war between car parks and buildings and car parks and economic development, and actually talk about our overall health, how much this is going to cost, what incentives are there for cities that save. We're in uncharted water at the moment, however, because for conservative, speaking as a political scientist now, just leaving IPCC, which isn't allowed to be policy prescriptive, but as a political scientist, National is in a very difficult position because their election pulled them to the right. So for those who are progressive within the Conservative bloc, they have few allies, and we have two minor parties who are magnified. It's the worst possible outcome of MMP, and it's rare that you get an opportunity for small parties to take leadership and visibility in a way that magnifies their voice and clout far and above of their actual legitimacy in a community. So managing that, politically, National strategy, I think, is to think, well, if those implode, we're still looking stable in the middle. But the difficulty is for those within National who are concerned, and many are, about climate, or about social change actually, there are few allies because the vote is shifting further and further to the right. And just as the Greens are starting to pull more and more to the left, it's leaving a very difficult space to have proper conversations about the pragmatic issues. And New Zealanders are pragmatic. We are fair and we are pragmatic. And it's not a sexy place to put politics, but it's a place that a lot of people understand, and it cuts across cultural difference. So I think sometimes we're in an exceptionally strong position in Ōtahi because Kaitahu has a very strong legacy and voice politically right now. So I think if you're going to talk about numbers and do them in ways that also work with objectives that are important for Ngāi Tahu, it becomes it cuts the political debates in a different way.
It would really help, because we can have a look at, in general, the demographics is going one way, which is in it, unfortunately, it's probably coincided with the last election, MMP. But as you say, there's so many youth, and moving into cities will help promote that more progressive attitude.
And also, I mean,
we need to see we need to see
the
that
good
the
news
processes that you're talking about will make significant differences. And I don't think people are getting that message.
No, and they are, but they're tucked away on the websites. We kind of need to push them forward. And also for progressive farmers as well. Like last year I did a lot of talks to farming groups, which I never expected. And I hadn't been aware, but you probably would have been, about how difficult it is to speak out in a rural community every time at mostly young, but also women, and some older farmers stood up and spoke. There was a wall of silence, of attack. It's very difficult right now for the farming communities, and it's very difficult for farming leaders to find the balance again. And I've given the National Party a hard time, but I think I'm not giving any praise to Labour as well. We're in a situation where it suits both parties to go for this cheap, fast option, and it will be a disaster for our environment.
Just quickly before I ask Jackie for her question, what is your thought on biodiversity credits? I'm asking this because within Ōnuku, within the takiwa of Ōnuku, we are wanting to deliver biodiversity outcomes on a really large scale, and it would enable us to be able to support farmers, for them to justify an incentive for them to justify the conversion of their land, or to look at larger ecological plantings, and for it to be of economic value for them to do that. And so it's kind of like the commodification of nature, which is quite interesting. It's using capitalism in a way for a good outcome. So it's an interesting thought. I'd love to hear your thought on that.
I think it's public now that Lisa Tumahai is leading a
we've been working with
project.
her.
So I'm always worried about the silver bullets, and I'm always worried about emissions trading more generally. It has a space and it has a role, but it is not the only tool, and it is a very small role. But I think we could learn from the mistakes of emissions trading with investment in biodiversity. And if we think of it as investment in biodiversity, then thinking about making sure that the regulations are consistent internationally. At the moment, there's an enormous amount of finance being moved and huge potential for corruption in many of these schemes. So it's crucial that the auditing, the accountability and the value add is around biodiversity and community development, and we're really explicit about that.
Yeah.
And carbon, and that the policies are aligned, that we're actually reducing emissions at the same time. We're not just, it's not like we're saying we're building lots of solar farms or we're building lots of green investment and still carrying on business as usual.
Yeah.
But I think it could be really exciting, and it's the kind of way you could change a conversation where a city can align with Ngāi Tahu. For instance, here you've got opportunities for that kind of alignment, or with farming communities, and just change the conversation, change the politics.
So we've heard, having this conversation last week with potential investors and with Hini Moana Halo, the term nature capital was used, which kind of encapsulates both carbon emissions and also biodiversity, but looking at more of a holistic view of really the benefits of nature and kind of putting a value on it. What's your thought on that?
Oh, I'm still not a great fan of nature-based services, but and putting a value on nature. But look, pragmatic, fair, what works, but be realistic. Learn what we've done from the disaster of our overemphasis on emissions trading, and think about what else we need to do in a holistic sense.
On that, Jackie.
Like within landscape architecture is a theory of eco-revelatory design, which is how the landscape can reveal change. For example, it could reveal how contaminated water passes through a filtering system, comes out and it's clean, and people can see that, they can drink it. So have you come across any examples in what you've been doing in terms of the way that the landscape can help to communicate to people?
Well, that's actually why we're taking the students to Hinawai and taking the students to Onuku tomorrow, because it's really practical examples, and especially at the moment when people are feeling overwhelmed, like especially for students, actually that practice of saying, and I've valued it as well. There's a colleague that I work with for about 20 years in New Delhi, and he's just run this one project really well for 20 years with the local university and his local community in the centre of New Delhi, and it's not fixing everything else, but it is an enormously inspiring project, Swetcher, of community development done well over a long time. And I think that's the other problem, is that a lot of our consulting and work is fast and quick, and we're not looking at both the VAR and the TAR, both the relationships and the time, and spending that building those relationships. So you talked about capacity building. I forgot to say that's one of the big threads, and we'd love to work with you on that, for how do we capacity build for the next generations of leaders in professions, and finding a way to really emphasise the importance of relationships and the importance of a sense of time, as well as, because then you've got the opportunity to show the change that happens.
Do you think that the environmental lobby groups that we have throughout the country are so disconnected with each other, or that unlike the agricultural rural sector, we don't have that kind of connected lobby for environment? Do you think that's something that needs to happen?
Well, it's so lovely, great to see you, because Grant, everything I learned about climate and landscape was at St Albans School, where you developed the playground in that kura, and there was so much politics in one community, in one little place. But thinking about how you get these messages across. I actually don't think that the agricultural community is. In fact, I've never been rung by so many anxious and worried leaders or recently ousted leaders of rural community groups who are very anxious about the changes that are happening, and very limited. And this is what I'm saying about how difficult it is for National at the moment. They're very limited in what they can say, because we've moved into this, we're moving the politics further and further to the right in a way that's leaving the communities behind, but it's magnified so everyone thinks, well, I must be the person out of step. And so I think actually a bit like landscape revelations, helping people see what other people think is important. And so creating spaces where people can come together is more important than it ever has been before, because it's I think about Onuku at the time when the community was so divided about their wastewater, and it's still going to be a difficult issue because it's so expensive now and every community needs a wastewater system. But the difference of bringing a predominantly non-Māori community onto a marae and just being in the space made a huge difference to a divided community. And I think my concern with the environmental groups is that they need to come, they need to work with Ngāi Tahu, they need to work with Māori. It's only ever been through treaty resistance that we've ever seen really our major environmental shifts. So it's breaking up the alliances, changing them. It's not the environment groups coming together, it's the kind of wider networks of change that includes those on the conservative left and right who are at the moment feeling disempowered.
Don't you see it in some parts of Aotearoa with iwi who aren't so corporate development focused as Ngāi Tahu are, that you do see much more association and relationship with environmental groups. I think Ngāi Tahu is very different than much of the rest.
Well, I think that Ngāi Tahu's water case will be huge, and I think it's going to really shift a conversation, but everybody's got a challenge of bringing their communities with them, yeah.
As a group of landscape architects, if there was anything, instruction or a final remark from you that we can take away to help to shape that better Aotearoa that we want to shape, what would it be?
Make public comments about the fast track legislation.
Yep, okay.
As well as urban density. I mean, I'm just so grateful to you, but right now we're going to change politics in a way that we have not anticipated. Its effects are going to be huge for democracy as well as for our environment. And it's not the attack on the environment, it's the fact that everybody loves it secretly because they're thinking, yay! And actually, we need the sensible, thoughtful, creative voices to go, we can have some change, we need some change, obviously, but this is going to be a different kind of politics that we haven't seen in this country, at least for ages. I can't think about long. Yeah, so I think this is a time really to actually start noticing. And it's going to be hard because the contracts are not going to be, it's going to be really hard.
Can I just add to that, just what you were saying, I'm worried. I work at NZILA, but in terms of comment about the fast track legislation, don't leave it just to your organizations to do that. Volume speaks volume. So, create a template and share it within your organization, and people can add those submissions individually. Volume is massive, and it will be acknowledged.
And even if it's like the thinking about what makes good decisions, like, you know all the roadblocks, but you also know the conditions that make good decisions. And I think we can overstate how, well, actually, I don't think we can overstate how bad this legislation could be. But I've had to take a step back when I've heard so many people secretly saying, I think it's great, really. You think, okay, this is a big problem we have, because it's going to be very hard to argue for why caution matters. It's always boring to be the people that go, yes, but. And I think the ways in which we have your professional design and creativity and thought and inspiration right now matters more than it has ever mattered.
you. Wow.